Welcome everyone to another edition of Moya Talks. We're closing out our Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and we have a special guest, Wanda Lau. Wanda, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Rodrigo, and thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you for accepting. It's been an honor. So, Wanda, let's start. We always start our talks learning a little bit about our guest, their background and career arc.
Yeah, so I started wanting to get into the building space to build and design more sustainably, but this was back in the late 90s, so I was a little bit ahead of the time when there were actually formal programs in sustainability in architecture schools and construction. So I studied civil engineering, so I don't have an architecture degree, but I studied civil engineering at Michigan State, and while I was there, I also studied construction management, landscape architecture, and interior design. So I sort of cobbled together a pseudo architecture degree, not really a degree, but just architectural background. And while I was at Michigan State, I also worked on the campus facilities and engineering department. So I was pretty active on campus construction sites and doing field inspections and owner reps responsibilities. And after graduating, I went to Simpson Gumpertz and Hager, which is a building consulting firm and engineering firm, as I think you mentioned, Rodrigo, that Moya has worked with. And I was based in the Arlington, Boston, Waltham, Massachusetts office. And I was there for 2 years before deciding to go back for my master's degree. I had considered architecture, going for an MArch. I went to Studio Disco, which is at Harvard GSD for summer. I loved the experience. I could see myself never sleeping while in studio, but I loved it that much. But at the end of the day, I thought that it was still, and this is the early 2000s, it was still a time when design was really just a lot of focus on design for design. And I really wanted to look a little bit more at materials and still sustainability. So I got my master's in building technology at MIT, focus on designing masonry structures using techniques that were more historical techniques that were, for example, very common in Catalan. So like lots of Gaudi, Guastavino vaulting. And part of that is because I had a structural background. Part of it is also, it's just the nature of which professor wants to work with you on a research project too, So, and I'm more than honored to have done that. But while I was at MIT, I also worked for the Graduate Student magazine. I was an intern at Boston Review, which is a literature magazine, but based on MIT's campus. And I had the opportunity to continue my master's degree and get a second master's right after MIT at Syracuse University at the Newhouse School. So I have a 1-year master's of journalism degree. And I still wanted to somehow make my way back into architectural journalism, but I had to find some inroads and somehow. So I interned at Men's Health magazine, which was really fun, actually. And then after Men's Health, I became the communications and PR and marketing director at KSS Architects, which I was in the Princeton office, but they have offices in Philadelphia and New York now. But while I was at KSS, I worked at KSS for about 4 years. And then that once in a while opportunity to work at Architect magazine opened up and I applied there.
What was the moment where you, in this process, decided, okay, I want to do journalism?
Yes, yeah. So I think there was a time somehow so SGH is a very writing heavy focused engineering firm. They write a lot of reports for clients, but also for litigation. So everything has to be very clearly written. Like you can't digress, you can't be flowery in your writing. You have to be very succinct about buildings. But at the same time, even at MIT, I was wondering if I could spend the rest of my life writing academic papers that were very, very technical and for a very specific audience. It wasn't very mainstream. So I wondered, is there a way that I could reach more people in a language that's more accessible about stories that were perhaps more interesting? So, while I was in engineering, I would tend to gravitate to articles that were published like in ENR magazine or architectural record, stories that are more approachable, about mainstream storytelling. So I would look at the mastheads of magazines and wonder, could I ever find a spot on that masthead for myself? Because there's not that many positions. And, so there's no one moment. It's more of a steady progression. And, I've always been interested in telling technical stories in a more interesting way. So I slowly found a way to do it. Just, and a lot of it is timing, a lot of it is like luck, a lot of it is networking, like when the opportunity is right. So, but I knew that I don't think I could ever be an academic and just focus on building research. So
it's complicated, the loneliness of academic work.
yeah. I mean, but the other thing is I was surrounded by people who love the work, and I just didn't have that same love for the academia. So, or
Having been part of it, I completely agree with you. Sometimes I feel like, who's going to read this? My tutor, maybe.
Yes. and there's a space for that too. I mean, that forms a lot of that becomes essential research for future, other work. But to me, I was more interested in reaching more people and attracting them to the idea of teaching them about building fundamentals and why buildings are important in this space. And I think I knew I could reach more people if I worked for a more magazine-like story versus like an academic journal.
My next question has to do with this because I have had many guests before that started with something like history or humanities and then move into more technical careers, or maybe they went to law school or something. But it's not usual that you move from a very technical background into something that is, I would say less, because it's not less, but you understand what I mean. So was there backlash? Was there pressure?
Yes, I completely understand what you mean. I will say that a hard day in journalism for me, being in trade journalism, has never been as hard as a hard day in engineering. We get those phone calls, but my advisor at MIT, I think, always knew I was a little bit on the fence. I also was active in, as mentioned, the grad student magazine, but also in photography. So he knew I was kind of straddling the artsy side of engineering. And then my parents might have been confused because I had studied engineering for so long. But at the same time, I actually still had a backup plan. Like SGH had very graciously offered me the opportunity to come back after grad school at MIT. And then when I told them I was staying for journalism, they still extended the offer. So I still always had an opportunity to have a job and go back. For that, I'm grateful. And I actually, when I'm based in DC, and SGH has a DC office as well. And they had a lunch and learn probably back maybe 4 to 5 years ago. And I actually went to the SGH office and I saw some of my direct bosses. And, I was kind of worried, like, what would they say because they give me all these opportunities, right? And then I just left it on the table. But they're people who want to see you do what you can do best and be happy for you. And there's a nice kind of full circle to see everyone talk about the subjects that they're passionate about, things that I used to work on too. And, it was nice to close that loop. And then I found out and then going back to my parents, while I was at Men's Health, which is probably the most kind of weirdest part of my story of my journalism trajectory into architectural journalism, I found out that when I told my mom that I had gone to KSS to work as their communications director, my mom said, "Oh, I can stop buying copies of Men's Health." She's buying like newsstand copies of Men's Health to help support like Men's Health. I'm like, "Oh, thanks, Mom. That's really nice of you." So, I think they at that point had trusted me that I would have like some kind of plan. And then you worry about professors and mentors who might have kind of pushed you toward engineering, but then they also just want the best for you too. So yeah, I'm still in contact with my Michigan State civil engineering professors, and I still trade holiday cards with them. And they're always being on the journalism side. I had the opportunity to be involved on like structural engineering juries, and they're always I won't say impressed, but they're just like, hey, I saw you in the structural engineering journal as a juror. That's an interesting trajectory,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Definitely enough, right? You joined Architect magazine. You worked there for 10 years.
Yeah.
You really contribute to shaping the building environment. How was the process of joining that and your experience throughout those 10 years?
Yes. So I joined as the technology and products editor initially back in 2011. I think I started on Halloween. And at the time, we had a larger staff. So a lot of the staff was concentrated on design coverage. So many people were focused on covering and chasing the same kind of the big budget, large, high profile projects by highly regarded, well-known designers with where budget is not concerned for projects. And so, but my approach was a little bit different. I always enjoyed covering building science, projects that may not have the biggest budgets, but I think that projects that had a good story to tell and that reached a lot of people, both from technical side, like these are things that are done well, and these are projects that can reach more people. And also by being at SGH, I was always a little skeptical of projects that had a lot of complexity that was unnecessary, and I could see future problems in water infiltration. For example, when I was at MIT, our building was adjoined the Stata Center by Frank Gehry, which at that time was pre all of the remediation efforts they did, but I could see things that were happening. I was like, great project, high profile, but lots of efflorescence, lots of problems there. So, these are topics I think the architects need to know more about. So I would focus on sustainability a lot. I focus on detailing, building science. And then I also, just naturally, I always wanted to have a diverse subject matter experts in my stories, whether it be authors, the writers of the stories, or panels or jurors for example, the R&D awards, which I oversaw. So, I've always tried to include at least, like for a panel of 3, I might always try to include one woman, one person of color, and then, in 2014, I really started to cover the issues of DEI more regularly. I had a conversation with Rosa Sheng, who at that time was leading the Missing 32%, which then become Equity by Design, but covering a lot about where the gender gap in architectural leadership is, and that of course became where all the people of color in architecture, and just trying to bring more attention to representation in architecture. So I, at Architect, also started covering more people. We launched an opinion department where I think I worked with probably more than 50 people who were activists in the DEI space to write opinion essays. So that includes like Karen Breitmeyer, Tammy Ubel, Kim Dowdell, Mi Jing Yoon, James Garrett Jr. Just trying to get just a lot of diversity in voices. And also just this people, I also would cover, as I mentioned, people as technical experts, like design experts. So people the idea of architect would be normal, the idea of an architect was inclusive. You could picture almost anyone as architect, which is the goal, I guess, for me. But then we actually started tracking the metrics. So by the end of my 9th, 10th year, more than half of the writers for Architect were women, and more than a quarter were people of color. For the sources, stories, on average, 40% were women, 40% were people of color. More than a third of the projects we covered were led by women-owned firms. About 40% were led by minority-owned firms. So, and then the staff that I left, who's still there, they expressed their desire to keep maintaining those metrics, which I'm proud of. So, I'm not the first one to cover women or people of color in architecture. Obviously, that's been done for forever, thank God. But I've done it regularly, rather than just being a one-off. Hey, we should cover some more women architecture. It's let's cover. It's regularly cover women in architecture and people of color in architecture. So,
what were the biggest challenge as a general editor, and how these global events shape your editorial decisions?
The biggest challenge, and I think this is true for a lot of media industry, is just the shrinking of media budgets. And that's true for local news as well as for trade publications. So I think you always hear that there's so much you want to cover and you just can't do it well enough or fast enough. So for us, the way we've kind of dealt with that is for world events that happen, we may not necessarily be the ones who are out there providing the breaking news coverage on the ground, but we can provide what we call day 2 coverage. So what can we bring as design editors or writers? What kind of insight can we bring to our audience that's relevant to the current news in a manner that we can speak about and that would be of interest to our audience that our audience can't find anywhere else in the news media. So, for example, for Sandy Hook in 2012, we covered the design revitalization efforts to design the new Sandy Hook school. For George Floyd, we covered architect reactions. Same with the Atlanta massacre of most Asian American women. Covered designers' reactions and feedback on community involvement, firm engagement, and commitments. Same with environmental news for topics such as the Paris Agreement. We covered we had a couple of issues dedicated to covering high performance and design and sustainability. We had a long running column and collaboration with Architecture 2030. So we try to provide a couple of insight we can provide.
It's very interesting because it loops back to your initial answer, right? You were talking about how when you started studying, you picture architecture as design by design, and then you can incorporate all these issues and you can transform the industry from another perspective.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to widen the conversation and discourse and elevate more voices and more topics that I thought people should or could learn more about, that would just also widen their perspective on what architecture means.
Now you're the editorial director for both LED magazine and Smart Buildings Technology. You started in January, right?
Correct. Yep, this week, month 5.
What is your vision for these two magazines?
Yeah, so I was an architect. I also worked on Architectural Lighting magazine, which was a lighting-focused magazine. But I always knew of LEDs as being a more technical, component-heavy magazine that focused a lot on testing and standards and manufacturing OEM components, which I appreciated too, and I love that coverage. But for LEDs, we're maintaining that tech component and also lighting industry business news with some of my current staff. So I have a managing editor, Carrie Meadows, who's really active, as well as some regular writers such as Mark Halper, who are covering that space really well. So I'm hoping to bring what I've done what I've done at Architect, and also expand the number of voices that are covered at LEDs. So we're adding in the June issue, we're adding a back page last word, which is an opinion essay. This upcoming one is by Alana Shepard, who's the founder of North American Coalition of Lighting Industry Queers. So actually, having more of voices both on DEI issues and issues of community design, or perhaps other industry topics that I think are of relevance. I also like to focus more on lighting design projects, for lighting projects that are also more community focused, not just high-end lighting design projects, but lighting projects by lighting designer firms of color, which it's also like a parallel lack of representation in lighting as it is in architectural design. So, and then I also am involved on Light Spec, which is the lighting conference that we're planning. So I've helped add some more people of color to the board for planning and also speakers. And then one of our keynote speakers for the Chicago event, so Light Spec's going to happen in LA as well as Chicago. The keynote for Chicago will be Jonathan Moody, who's the CEO of Moody Nolan's, everyone knows, but he's a frequent contributor architect that I know that I think will provide a very nice, good voice and input and insights to the lighting community.
Yeah. Jonathan was one of our first guests of Moya Talks.
He's such a nice guy. He's brilliant. And then for SBT, I also hope to cover continue covering the environmental aspects of design. So speaking from someone who was an architect, I never covered much before Project Handoff. So all those great design objectives that people intend to have with their innovative forms and systems, no one ever knows that they actually work out. So I'm hoping to bridge that gap and across the building ecosystem, from design and development to planning, all the way to owner occupancy, and all the way to building operations, and just the tweaking you need to do to keep buildings running as they are intended to do to meet those net zero goals. They aren't static machines, as people have seen probably, with building users and occupancy needs and programs changing, especially with the pandemic now. But then also the role of technology in that space, which kind of relates to building systems integrations, some post-occupancy studies, and another topic I want to focus on is also in SBT is also workforce. There's a dearth of facility operators, and that's a great opportunity for someone who wants to be involved in the building space to get involved in energy efficiency and reductions without requiring even a 4-year degree, probably, just requiring technical. And that's a big that's a big barrier to overcome. It's like a shortage of workers who are knowledgeable about IT and also OT, specifically about buildings. So that's another area I hope to cover soon.
We will look back to these journalists and architect questions, especially when the people participate. But I had another question for you. As a second generation Chinese American, what does Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month mean to you?
It's a reminder of the contribution that Asian Americans and Pacific Islander community has given to this country. And it's time to honor and reflect their work in every aspect of how this country operates, from infrastructure to policy to literature and art, professional services such as design, engineering, to hospitality, and also as just neighbors in the neighborhood. I'm speaking for myself here because I grew up in a family that really valued humility. So we never try to take up too much space, too much time, be too loud in the space. But and that might be partially in response to the way my family was perceived as outsiders or foreigners who don't deserve a platform. So I think having this month that's dedicated to celebrating Asians, it really makes it a purpose to celebrate Asian Americans who may not feel as comfortable to proclaim their own successes just based on different cultural values. So people who this month gives us a time to celebrate and recognize people who may not be asking for it. But then this is also a country that tends to operate by giving those with the loudest voices the largest platforms or the highest leadership roles. So I think this is a month of time to reflect on that and celebrate on those individuals in the communities.
It ties to my next question, just what you mentioned at the end, because this is a broad category that is given in a sense. So what experiences do you feel are not visibilized by this public discourse?
Yes, I think a lot of people more recently have brought up the issue of how all Asians are lumped together as Asians. And, there's differences, so many nuances in that. There's, not to mention like East Asians versus South Asians and Southeast Asians and the Pacific Islanders, but also Asian Americans versus Asians, immigrants versus second generation. Everyone's experience is just different, just similar to anyone else. Everyone's individual experiences are different to their circumstances and surroundings. So I think grouping us together has been a disservice. But, I think that moreover, and this is true for anyone, the stories that tend to get coverage are those of either success or those of extreme tragedy. So the people who have the ability to have a platform, who know how to speak out and reach those who have some agency or power, those are the ones who tend to get more coverage. So, and then the communities who without agency are rarely given a voice, and that's true for underserved communities of anywhere. And then they similarly may not, probably like my parents, believe that they have one or deserve a voice in this space when their stories are equally important. So, that is part of my goal in trying to find these people who are deserving of space.
Wanda, I'm going to open the floor and allow people, the audience, to ask questions. So please go ahead, people. It's always an awkward moment.
I have one quick question. Given the architectural or the built environment at this age, how do you find yourself as a writer? Being more critical or more hopeful of what's out there?
Yeah, so I think that the architectural discourse has made me more hopeful. Some things that I should mention is like seeing the AIA's like part of the strategic plan. The two tenets they have are increasing equity and focusing on climate change, and that's like amazing for for architects to. Those are those two things that the organization values, and that means a lot because I think these are part of the greater good. So I am hopeful. I've also, I used to work with Ed Mazria quite a bit for Architecture 2030, and he is someone who knows better than many of us the facts about climate change. But yeah, he's able to still, when he speaks, he takes on a very optimistic tone. We were able to change improve our manufacturing and make changes back in the early 20th century, and we could do the same in terms of carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, if we dedicate our efforts to it. And I think people are more inspired to act when it's not a doomsday story, but it's more stories of how other people have carved successes and ways that they could also find their own way to make success based on the resources that they have or the environment that they're in which they're working.
That's beautiful. Noor, please go ahead.
So as a researcher and architecture critic, what do you think the current school of thought is? You know, architecture gone through several school of thoughts from avant-garde and so on, but do you see a significant school of thought other than initiatives like sustainability and all of that, but school of thought, is there any school of thought right now that you can find people have or architects have?
Yeah, I know there's been a lot more vocal criticisms from students and studios who are decrying like the typical Eastern European canon of body of works of that every student studies in studio, and trying to open that up to be more inclusive of other cultures and other designs. I don't think I would ever identify myself as an architecture critic because I just don't know enough about architectural design or history or I'm not focused mostly on design. I'm focused mostly on the science of design. So whether things work successfully or whether energy efficiency goals are achieved, that's more of where my space is. I will leave any design school criticisms or identities of schools of thoughts to people who actually are architects, probably. But I come from a building science point of view, so I'm a little more. Also, plus I'm a little more objective because I should be. So I don't think that's super helpful, but I do see more people speaking out about trying to be more inclusive about the bodies of works that students and even architects celebrate as part of the canon.
That's great. Thanks.
There are points in common because actually Noor is also specializes in reusing material techniques.
That's awesome. That's something I aspire to do. I think if I had stayed in architecture, I would want to go into adaptive reuse or energy efficiency, living buildings.
We're going back to the historical techniques that our ancestors were used to do for a more sustainable building. That's what we're trying to do in locally designing in our original of countries.
That's wonderful. Yes, yeah. That's great. One of my lab mates who's doing really great work, a couple of my lab mates are doing great work, was Philippe Bloch, who runs the Bloch Lab and is doing a lot of great masonry vaulting work. And then also Michael Ramage is in England doing I think does a lot of timber work now too, like a lot of timber design construction as well as masonry construction.
Cool.
Yep, there is. We have time for one more question. So if no one goes ahead, I will make the last question. All right, Wanda. So last question. I really love the podcast you're doing for Smart Building. And I really like the way you weave this technical knowledge with a discourse that a layman can follow. So my question to you is, how do you transmit this to your staff? How do you help them succeed in this sense?
Yes. So I'm very a details person, and I'm also trying to be a better overall editor person. But I always find that if I'm reading something and something catches me off guard or takes me a moment to figure out what the meaning is, I have to rewrite it because anything that will deter a reader from a story will send them away. So I'm very or even something like a word that people might not understand and they have to pause and be like, what does that mean? Look it up. That will also, I think, deter readers from reading the story. So I always will ask for clarification. So I'm pretty hard, like very detail oriented editor, which my writers may or may not like, but it makes their stories sound better at the end of the day. And the other thing that I have going for me is that I have I have a case of imposter syndrome. So I feel like I come to stories not knowing anything, which I think makes the story more accessible to an audience coming from also maybe not, particularly not with the background that the expert in the story might have. So they come, with I have a baseline of knowledge that because it comes from working in architecture and construction, that I know what a baseline foundation could be for what most readers who are reading smart buildings technology will come to the article with. But above that, I will always try to reach back into those entry points and make sure that the reader is coming along for the article and enjoying the story. So those are the tools I use for editing and writing and assigning stories.
Nice. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We really appreciate you taking
It's
the time.
been so fun. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so honored.
I really recommend to the staff to listen to Wanda's podcast.
Yes,
So
I
will
only
link it.
I only have one episode out on SBT. I have 2 recorded that I have to edit, but I also have a bunch that I recorded back in Architect Magazine. But please listen. Smartbuildingstech.com.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
See you
It was
next
awesome.
week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.